I don't believe in functional hierarchies. I don't believe in this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 list of cognitive functions assigned in a descending order based upon this kind of arbitrary preference for one over another. Even when using a 4-function model, I still use the continuums in order to inform how one function relates to another one. And as such, I'm going to be describing 4 functions in relation to the continuum they each reside within. So first, let's take the dominant function in relation to the oppositional function. So the dominant function is a convergent function. In CPT, convergence describes having conscious responsibility for a function. It is used as part of the ego complex in order to make new connections, in order to find new novel ways of perceiving, of doing things. Essentially, it is a highly creative attitude. Whereas as the opposite of the dominant, the oppositional function is highly divergent. Therefore, it is more negativistic, it is consequence instilling. It's not creative, it's much more rigid, and it serves as a kind of authority, not only to compel the dominant function with an agenda, but also to anchor the dominant function into reality, to stop the dominant function getting too carried away with itself. The dominant function is by far the greatest degree to which CPT can overlap with other systems because I view it in a very similar kind of way to other systems. It is a central part of our ego complex. It is the state that we most commonly reside within. And the cognitive magnetism towards a dominant function is definitely higher than any other function. Even though cognitive magnetism does vary very much according to context, we will always be drawn towards the embrace, if you like, of our dominant function. However, where I may very well depart from some other systems is where the dominant function can actually play an oppositional role. The dominant function can actually become what is known as the inferior function of other systems. The dominant function can effectively rotate on the axis with the oppositional function to a state in which the oppositional function becomes the dominant function, so thus convergent, and what was once the dominant function becomes oppositional and thus divergent. And to be able to explain this dynamic any further, I must now visit the oppositional function and the role this function usually plays. The oppositional function, known as the inferior for some reason in other systems, is actually incredibly multifaceted. It can actually play more than one possible role within the human psyche. So let's take the default role. The default role of the oppositional function is like an anchor. It's an anchor into reality. It's something to prevent the dominant stack from getting too carried away in its creativities. Extroverted sensing, in an INFJ such as myself, will compel me to ground myself in reality. It serves as a check and balance system to ensure that I never dwell entirely within an overly abstract mental state. It ensures that the concoctions within my mind have an extroverted sensing feedback. Therefore, there's a constant give and take between extroverted sensing, the anchor, and the dominant function of introverted intuition. And therefore, I'm often imagining tangible, concrete experiences. The second role my oppositional plays is as my primary external lens. My primary external lens isn't extroverted intuition because my intuition, which is the same function, it doesn't matter whether it's extroverted or introverted, it's still the same function, is pulled internally. Therefore, any kind of extroverted intuitive gazing I will be doing will be at the expense of my introverted intuition. And yes, while it is possible for me to employ extroverted intuition in a highly conscious manner, it is not natural to do so. It is less intuitive than employing extroverted sensing. So since extroverted sensing is my primary lens, this gives me a very intense gaze. This gives any extroverted sensing oppositional, whether they're an INTJ, INFJ, or anything in between, a very intense, focused, and often what could be considered frightening or even intimidating gaze, because we look very specifically, it's a hyperdivergent extrovert sensing, and therefore the gaze will always be accompanied with this kind of annoyance that you've pulled us away from our abstract reality. Therefore the gaze is not only extremely focused, but it's also looking at you specifically as if you've just tugged me away from abstract reality back into the concrete, and I'm completely and utterly fixated on you. I'm completely and utterly fixated, in this instance, on the camera lens. This is extrovert sensing. I'm not gazing everywhere around the room, I'm locking into specific things. So far we have the oppositional playing the role of an anchor, and we also have the oppositional, in my case, playing the role of a lens. Conversely, in a codec dominant, such as an INFP or ENFJ, the oppositional function would instead be performing the role as the primary external, or in the case of the ENFJ, internal codec. This is a different ballgame, but it's still performing the role as an anchor into reality, and a means by which the person can primarily connect with the world opposite to their dominant orientation. Yet another role of the oppositional function is contained within a very important feedback loop between it and the dominant. In this instance, we have the opposite orientation of the oppositional function. Therefore, to take myself again, an INFJ, I have introverted intuition. But this introverted intuition isn't just in this island by itself in the middle of this vast ocean. No, it is intrinsically connected to the oppositional function of the same orientation, introverted sensing. Introverted sensing isn't this demonic function, it isn't this evil, strange, mythologically informed function performing an unconscious but highly mischievous role within my psyche, manifesting as various different complexes. No, not at all. It is a function intrinsically connected to the effective employment of my introverted intuition. If I was just using introverted intuition without introverted sensing, because remember it's a continuum between introverted intuition and introverted sensing, so abstract versus concrete, I would not be able to perceive any kind of details. I would not even be able to hone into specific words in order to effectively communicate to you what I'm thinking. No, just introverted intuition by itself is just vague, plethoric, and it cannot hone into details. Without a feedback loop between introverted intuition and introverted sensing, I would be completely useless. Same goes for introverted sensing in, let's say, for argument's sake, an ISFJ. If this individual was just using introverted sensing as a dominant function, they would not be able to perceive any kind of connection to a larger picture. They'll just be looking at specific details or specific memories, specific concrete realities within their internal landscape, and just seeing them at face value, not making any kind of connections, not drawing a connection between one thing and another, not even sufficient as to employ heuristics. Both functions need each other. Every function and every single continuum needs the other one, whether it's one orientation or the other. And therefore the third role the oppositional function plays is actually as an integral part of the dominant function. The dominant function isn't on this island, remember. A dominant function is on a continuum, and therefore a dominant function is actually a portion of that continuum that is rotating between a high degree of introverted intuition in this case and a small degree of introverted sensing. And yes, it is even possible for me to employ a high degree of introverted sensing and vice versa. And this is why I stress a more fluid approach to psychology. And finally, my fourth favourite, if there is such a thing, role of the oppositional function is to actually play a role as an alternative dominant function. If you rotate on your axis to your oppositional function, so in my case, extroverted sensing, you become the opposite type. You become, in my case, an ESTP type while you're engaging that. Yes, you're probably not going to do it for very long. Yes, the cognitive magnetism of introverted intuition is always going to pull you back towards your normal state relative to your own individuation process, of course. But to varying durations of time, the oppositional function can actually become the dominant. I can become an extrovert sensing dominant and thus using extrovert sensing and extrovert feeling, the codec to which it is attached, in a convergent manner. I'm not only observing the external world, I'm actually taking responsibility for it and playing an active role. This is how I connect with other people. This is how I have very intense one-on-one conversations, interactions. This is how I would play a video game. This is how I'd play my guitar, for example, as a musician. This is how I would perform to a crowd of people. And conversely, let's say an ENFJ rotates on their axis to become a more ISTP-like personality type. This is how they would navigate in a convergent manner their internal world. This is how they would take responsibility for their internal frameworks.